We have returned, ladies and gentlemen, for an actual guide this time, for an actual frame. Shocking, isn't it? Well, Titania recently got primed. At last. And along the way, since our last guide we did for her, she's had some rather nice little comfort of life changes made, to the point where she's actually a bit different now to what she's been. And I've always stated that whenever a frame becomes newer or has changes enough to mean needing a new video, then, well, we go back and remake it, kind of like how we are now. Now, one of the greatest things about Titania is her simplicity in build, as one build can generally meet all the standards you would hope to achieve with playing this delightful frame. But therein you are not limited to that one build. No sir, you can evolve and adapt it to meet other standards as well, such as Eidolon hunts or being more buffy and being more of a supportive type frame. Yes, that's right, she does have the ability of supporting, and no, I do not believe anyone that says she doesn't. The point being is, when you build for one specific notion with Titania, the way she is as a default will subsidize what you don't build for. So if you build for support, then you still have the insane damage that she naturally pumps out due to the way she is just by default. Or if you go by default damage, then her support roles still play a pivotal role in the way she plays, just by the way they work on their own. And with the... and I do stress this, unlimited power of her fourth ability. Just by power alone, Titania becomes a frame that most people rather enjoy playing just for being able to massacre everything, but also leads for being a frame to be something you can learn the game with. And although she may not be the best of a crowd controller, and although she may not give the most potent of buffs, she is unbelievably fun, and just the raw numbers she pumps out alone can often be enough of a reason to play her. Obtaining Titania is a bit of a pain in the arse, however, as you need to do a grinding, repetitive flower-picking simulator known as wrong game. A flower-picking quest known as Silver Grove, which you can start from the new local leader on any relay. And the quest, thematically, has a lot of fascinating plot devices to it, not so to mention Titania's big old... tracts of land. But I didn't really choose to play Warframe to pick plants. So now there's Titania Prime, which realistically and honestly takes a fraction of the time of doing her quests. So yeah, another one of those instances where getting the Prime variant is actually easier than getting the regular variant. DE, have you considered maybe remastering the way this works? I'm just wondering. Welcome to City 17... No, wrong game again. Whoops. Welcome to the fancy new and improved simulacrum with Gara and Boruk watching over me as I fail to show you how frames work. Starting this next part with the passive of Titania, which is rather interesting to say the least. By default, Titania's passive gives her 25% additional bullet jump and rolling distance, which... well, yeah... yay for movement, I guess. But additionally to that, and helping encourage the idea of her supportive type role, Titania does regenerate 4 health per second for 20 seconds to any ally within range and to herself whenever she casts an ability, which is nice, I guess. Especially considering that you do end up spamming abilities in certain situations. The first ability to look at is a Spellbind. No, not the movie. This ability will shoot dust at a spot she aims at, within 50 meters. Any enemy affected by Spellbind by the sparkle dust will drop their gun and be incapacitated for 16 seconds, floating away in a ragdoll state like a dainty floaty ballerina. Also, as a boon to your team, you can cast it on your team to make them immune to status effects. Holding the button will cast it onto yourself, and it will allow you to then benefit your allies as well. There is a radius of an area of effect of initially 5 meters around the initial impact of enemies getting affected. That then is affected by ability range, and the duration the buff or debuff lasts for is then affected by ability duration. So not only is it a half-decent crowd control, but it does act as a supportive role as well. And yes, support Titania does exist. No one can convince me otherwise. Titania's 2 is Tribute, kind of like that Tenacious D song. In simple terms, this is a Swiss Army buff that can now be tailored to provide 4 different buffs like it used to, but now you have the ability of deciding which buff you want. whereas before it was tailored by what the type of enemy was. Now, if you tap your 2 ability, it will cycle between the 4 different buffs, which will explain what they do in a moment. Now, once you cast this ability, the enemy is then knocked down, leaving a shadow of themselves in their original spot. If they survive the damage, they have their damage reduced by 25% for 12 seconds. The shadow left behind is then an offering buff. The buff being dictated by the ability you had selected at the time. This will stick around. This shadow will then stick around for a short period of time, allowing yourself or allies to pick it up. The allies can directly pick it up themselves, but if you pick it up, it will then benefit your allies within range as well. This can also then be picked up by the Razorwing butterflies that you generate when you're in your pixie mode. So the buffs themselves, we're going to take a look at what they each do, starting with Thorns. Thorns is a tribute aura which will reduce incoming damage by 50% and reflect 50% of damage taken back at the attacker. Any allies within range of the person who picks it up, whether it be you or someone else, will also benefit from that damage reduction and reflection as well. So you can kind of treat this as yourself or your allies becoming a bastion projecting the buff itself. Dust is a simple one. Dust is a tribute aura that reduces the accuracy of enemies within range of you by 50%. So essentially, you become a little bit like Baruch when he's got his elude on. So when Dust is active, enemies will find it harder to hit you. Full Moon is the 3rd buff you can generate. Full Moon will increase the damage dealt by companions and razorflies by 75%, as well as then increasing their health and armor by 50%. And once again, it becomes a projection upon your team, allowing your team to also gain those benefits as well should they pick the buff up. And the final buff being generated is Entangle. Entangle is very simply a slow. Enemies within range will have their movement speed reduced by 25%. Now on to Titania's 3. Similar to Titania's 1, Titania's 3, which is called Lantern, will cause an enemy within 25 yards to be hover in position and become completely invulnerable. Now, you might be saying, Makari, why are we making the enemy invulnerable? Well, Billy, the reason for this is that any enemy that will come within 20 meters of the Lantern target will become mesmerized. Ooh. They will become mesmerized by the daintily bouncing body and its beauty, forgetting everything else where they were doing and following the lantern, in essence acting like a bug zapper. Enemies nearby that come within 2.5 meters of the lantern target will then take 350 heat damage per second. So basically, you turn an enemy into a floaty bug zapper that CCs and also deals damage to them. You could ask, what makes this any better? Well, it does get better. The Lantern target, upon expiration of the buff or manual detonation, will explode, dealing a small amount of damage, and by small I mean 2,500, to enemies within 8 meters. You can, alternatively, then stack this up multiple times on multiple enemies, and the explosion damage will then become infinitely stronger. Now, the damage of this ability is dictated by power strength, and because you are naturally building power strength with most of your builds in the first place, this ability can be quite powerful at the lower levels, but realistically, you're not going to see much death potency beyond maybe level 100. The range of the explosion and the range of the attraction is then based on your range. However, the default attraction range is quite large by default, so you're going to naturally see the enemies getting drawn in quite quickly anyway. And then the duration of the lantern itself and how long they're floating around like a dainty ballerina is then based on your ability duration. And if you feel like just self-detonating it, then that is probably the more advisable way of doing it. And by default, with a lot of normal builds for Titania, because you're actually going to be ending up with minus duration, you might end up finding that these will just naturally detonate within a couple seconds of casting anyway. If you're going to use this ability in any large amount, you'll definitely want to utilize the augment, which is called Beguiling Lantern. Beguiling Lantern is really... It helps compound the effectiveness of the ability itself. Beguiling Lantern will cause any enemy affected by the lantern to take 100% additional melee damage, which really, 100% additional melee damage, it actually endears itself to a build in of itself, because you can essentially build for pure range, affect an enemy by lantern, and then any enemy that comes within range of the lantern will then be taking 100% bonus melee damage, which in reality is really powerful. Like, especially if you've got a team of people who are trying to help you as well. Having all enemies affected by this taking 100% bonus damage is really nice. Now for what you've all probably known Titania for. Her fourth ability to turn into a dainty pixie princess. Upon activation, Titania will shrink down into a tiny Arcwing mode, gaining similar controls to how you would pilot an Arcwing. In this mode, Titania will gain 2 new exalted weapons, the GLYPH and the Diwata. This mode will drain energy over time, but thankfully not too heavily. Especially with a decent build, this mode extenuates raw damage. And as the modding you put towards your 2 exalted weapons will demonstrate just how powerful she can be. Even with subpar modding, the speed and raw numbers that you put out will easily destroy enemies of level 69 to 100 with no issue whatsoever. Compounding that you can then have some synergy with weapons such as the Arcus Skizco. The Arcus Skizco gives you 5% status chance and crit chance every time you kill an enemy with your secondary. And seeing as your GLYPH actually counts as a secondary, you naturally build up 20% bonus status chance and crit chance whilst using it. So having that as kind of like a stat stick whilst you're playing is extremely useful. For the exalted weapons by default, the GLYPH are a duo of repeating hand cannons with a base damage of 160 per shot, divided with 10% impact, 10% puncture, and 80% slash damage, with a fire rate of, and wait for it, 5.83 shots per second. So just by default, they have an insane amount of fire rate. The GLYPH also have a base damage of 200% crit damage and 10% crit chance with a 25% status chance. So you might be wondering, why the hell would you want to do anything else? And that is a question I have to ask myself as well. The Diwata is then a melee weapon with a base damage of 200 per hit, divided between 50% impact, 75% puncture, and 10% slash, with a 200% crit damage multiplier and 20% crit chance and 10% status chance. Admittedly, I would always prefer the GLYPH between the two, but they are both insanely powerful in of themselves, and when you utilize this with the augment as well, you'll generally find just how powerful these can become. Additionally, they are both then improved further by being able to mod them through your arsenal. Now, when it comes to builds for these, it's all down to personal preference, but going for raw damage is always going to win out in most cases, going for an element of some kind and then playing to their strength. Hybridization or going for full crit builds will always work wonders here, but ideally you synergizing this with your frames build will then allow you to pump out the damage you want to. If you want to go for a build for either of them, basic build with crit generally works out well, but working to whatever strength you feel would work for you will generally not go amiss, as they are both insanely powerful just by default. Something that often goes a bit underappreciated with the Pixie mode is the butterflies. Whilst in Pixie mode, you gain Titania's butterflies, which basically do your bidding in this mode. These butterflies will attack enemies for 80 damage per hit, and they will also go and fetch buffs for you from your tribute enemy, and for each tribute you activate, you gain an extra butterfly up to a maximum of 4 additional butterflies. And they're not really going to do much damage. They're not really going to do anything beyond just to be a little bit of an assistance, but they're worth keeping an eye on, as they do also then benefit from health mods and reduction as well. And above all else, they can also then distract enemies for you as well. So you would think with all that she'd be done, but no. She also has an augment called Razorwing Blitz, and this augment is absolutely nutty and insane. Each time you cast, it will give you 25% bonus fire rate and flight speed for 8 seconds, and stacks 4 times, which takes your already fast-firing weapon from something that fires like a friggin' Gatling cannon into something that basically resembles that of a god weapon. And when you take into consideration the additional movement speed, you kind of maybe break the game a little bit with how fast you can move. So people who say Gauss is the fastest frame in the game clearly have not played Titania with this augment. Neither have anyone seen pure raw damage until they've seen this either. And really, if you're going to be using Titania at all, not having this augment is a massive misdemeanor. There's basically no reason why you don't want this augment, and as it is just an additional raw amount of damage you're adding to your build for very little input. And as ever with these kind of guides, we always have a build segment, which is idealized around a new player's experience. So we have our end goal build right here, and then we'll have a new player incentivized build as well, which will help you transition between the two. But as ever with these builds, take your own mind's eye towards them. Don't take my build as gospel. The entire point of Warframe is that it's your preference as to how you play. So although this works for me, Use this as inspiration. Build upon it. Work upon it. Use your own inspirations for your own builds. So this build initially is kind of like an end goal build for a generalized pixie build where you're utilizing your Razor Wing for the most part. Aura spots are always down to personal preference. I personally like Corrosive Projection, but because you are going to be relying on energy a lot in this build, utilizing Energy Siphon is also a good choice. Then, as with a build based around one ability, we want as much power strength as possible. We got power strength, Augur Secrets, Transient Fortitude, Intensify. All of that is going to push your strength up to 219%, which you could go higher with Blind Rage as well, but the minus efficiency is a bit too heavy in my eyes, especially if you don't have things to help you circumvent the energy drain you would then have. We then have Fleeting Expertise and Streamline, both one level below the max, so we get the 175% efficiency without the heavy requirements. That then allows you to stay in pixie mode almost indefinitely. You then have Continuity to help counteract the loss of duration and to also help you with the channeling time as well on your Razor Wing mode. You then have Adaptation, but Adaptation is subjective. As ever, survival mods are down to personal preference. If you want Steel Fiber, Vitality, or whatever else in there, that will work wonders as well. And then, of course, we have Razor Wing Blitz. If you don't have the augment, then you could, in theory, put another survivability mod or whatever you so choose. Even more duration or range could be effective here as well. Either way, when it comes to the generalized build, if you don't want to rely as much on your pixie mode and you want to maybe make use of your supportive roles, then you would take away power strength and replace it with range instead, as your range will then allow your buffs to hit further. It'll allow your lantern to hit further and attract enemies from a further distance away as well. And this is going to be the more new player incentivized build. These are always builds that can be obtainable and farmable within the first couple weeks of playing the game. When it comes to the slightly harder mods to get, I will mention them, but for a new player incentivized build, this will help keep you alive and it will help you understand Titania better. So we start with Flow just for that bit of extra energy because you're not going to have as much efficiency in the early stage. Intensify for that power strength, Augur Secrets for the power strength. Now, Augur Secrets is a slightly harder one to get. It's really easily obtainable in the early stage from Eidolon bounties and from Thumpers, but obviously it's got a really low drop rate, so you would have to try and farm this out. This could be replaced by anything of your choosing. Thankfully with Titania, and as I mentioned earlier, the build's your oyster. Because of Titania's default strength and power she has, you can kind of mix and match the build however you want, and you'll never really have a bad build. So this again could be replaced by anything or even nothing if you haven't got anything to replace it with. Then we've gone with some more survivability with some Steel Fiber and Vitality. 100 Adrenaline and Augur Message. These are again both from Plains of Eidolon bounties for the most part. 100 Adrenaline, you could replace that with Rage, which also comes from enemy drops on Plains of Eidolon or Grineer in general, just for that extra bit of efficiency with energy. But otherwise, the duration is just to help you push out. That could again be replaced by Continuity. Even Flow could be replaced with Continuity if you don't fancy utilizing as much energy. As well as you have to realize in the early stage of playing Titania, because you don't have the efficiency or energy efficiency at this stage, you're not likely going to be in your pixie mode all the time. So you want to make sure when you're not in pixie mode that you can stay alive a bit better and have a bit more consistency to the way you play. Now, something that can be done with any build at any time, and a suggestion I would make based on your personal preference, is Aviator. I personally don't use it, but I can attest to you that this is a fantastic thing to use because you are going to be airborne a lot. And this could, in theory, replace out any of your survivability mods and just give you an overall increase in survivability across the entirety of your playstyle with Titania. And that's the guide. It's updated, it's fancy, and it feels a bit more professional than our previous one, even with all the references in it. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you feel like joining our fellow Tenno here that joined us in the guide, then I'll leave a link to my Twitch and my Twitter down below. So if you feel like joining us and making these videos, then by all means drop by and pop us a follow. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Hopefully this Titania guide has been informative and hopefully you've learned a bit more about our dainty pixie princess. And I'll see all of you top hatters in the next video. Ta-ra!